Before we get started, I want to thank our museum director, Stephen McClansky, and our partners at Friends of the Cabildo for sponsoring this program. If you have not yet purchased the Yellow House, you can do so through the 1850 House Museum store, and we'll be sure to link to that briefly. We also have several other programs coming up that you might be interested in, and I just want to briefly shout those out. On October 8th, author Melissa Daggett will be speaking on spiritualism in 19th century New Orleans. And on November 12th, Shane Leaf will be speaking on his recent book, Giacomo, The Native Roots of Mardi Gras Indians. We also encourage you to check out our website, louisianastatemuseum.org, for more information on these programs and other upcoming courses and events. Just to give you a brief run of show, I'll turn it over to Leslie in just a minute, and she and Sarah will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, after which we will turn to audience questions. So feel free to submit questions via the chat function at any time throughout the program, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our two panelists for this evening. Sarah in Broom is a writer whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Oxford American, and O Magazine, among others. She is the recipient of the National Book Award for Nonfiction and the John Leonard Prize for the best first book for her memoir, The Yellow House, the reason that we are all gathered tonight. A native New Orleanian, she received her master's in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley in 2004. And she was awarded the Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Grant in 2016 and was a finalist for the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Creative Nonfiction in 2011. She's also been awarded fellowships at the Gerasi Resident Artist Program and the McDowell Colony, and she lives in Harlem. Leslie M. Harris is a professor of history at Northwestern University and the author or co-editor of 3 award-winning books, including In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, with co-editor Ira Berlin, of Slavery in New York, which accompanied the groundbreaking New York Historical Society exhibition of the same name, and of Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, co-edited with Dinah Rainey Berry in collaboration with Telfair Museum's Owens Thomas House. Harris has recently published Slavery and Sexuality, Reclaiming Intimate Histories in the Americas with Dinah Rainey Berry, and Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies with James T. Campbell and Alfred L. Brophy. As the 2020-2021 Beatrice Shepard Blaine Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, she will complete a book on late 20th century New Orleans entitled Leaving New Orleans, A Personal Urban History. And with that, I also want to thank the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism and Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser for helping us make this program possible, and turn it over to Leslie Harris. That's fine.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's a real honor and a thrill to be here this evening with Sarah Broom. I can't see her, but I assume she's out there.
I can see you.
Oh, there you are. You just came up. Great. It's great to see you. And
Great to see you.
To meet you and to have this opportunity. I do wish we were in New Orleans having this conversation with all the great people who are on Zoom with us, but it's a pleasure nonetheless. Are any of your family members and friends tuning in today, do you think?
You know, I hope so. I don't know. I can't see all of the little boxes for some reason. I'm just seeing your face, so
yeah.
I hope so. I have to have some of my cousins or maybe even nieces or nephews here.
Right, yeah. I think some of my family is here, but I don't know. Maybe they'll watch the video later. Well, we were rescheduled from near the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Of course, there Hurricane Laura. You were in New York and got hit by a storm when during that time, which is why we had to reschedule. I hope things are better up there now. you know, a major part of your book is recapturing an intimate New Orleans before Katrina. And I think that for so many who don't live in New Orleans, there's a sense New Orleans came on their radar with Katrina. And so I really appreciate the book for doing that. But you also talk about the after Katrina. And in the 15 years since Katrina, it's hard to believe it's been 15 years. Sometimes it feels like it just happened, I think.
Sure.
But there are a lot of people going before and after. And now in 2020, this is going to be another year, I think, when we're all going to be saying before and after, before the pandemic, after. So I wanted to just take a minute and take a breath on that. It's 15 years since Katrina. We're in the middle of another moment. And your book came out almost a year ago, I think.
Right, yeah, a little over a year.
Yeah, how are you? Like, what are you thinking now? How do you feel now in 2020, talking about this book, talking about this anniversary in a sense, and thinking about New Orleans?
Well, you know, it's really interesting because I remember, you know, around the time when the Katrina anniversary comes, I don't think I or anyone in my family is necessarily thinking of it as a news peg. We just feel it in our bodies. And you kind of wake up the week of feeling that something is a bit askew and wondering what it is. And then you remember that this is the week. And even just saying it, I can begin to feel it in my shoulders and in my body. And I think, you know, part of the work that I was trying to do in the Yellow House was to give, I'm really obsessed with context. And for that reason, I don't always love the anniversaries of things, because it forces us to kind of condense what is a kind of rocking, you know, unmooring experience into a little bit of a sound bite. And sometimes what I want most is to slow down, you know, and feel my way through it. And I think that's what this time is about. As so much happens outside of the window, our windows and our doors, as so many of us are quarantined and inside, trying to navigate so much change and feeling our way through it. I'm trying to be very much in this moment, and to also remember that this is a time of grieving 15 years ago, of grieving 15 minutes ago, you know, and people dying daily of COVID. So this moment there's nothing distinct, it feels, about what happened then and what's happening now.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think you're right. This time is forcing us to slow down, and not just to slow down around the events that are happening now, but things that we've hurried over, rushed over, and bringing us back to a reconsideration of some of those moments in our own lives, and thinking about how they reverberate. Totally agree with you there. Well, I really enjoyed reading the book, even though it's full of, for exactly that reason, really immerses you in so many histories and people, and it's so beautifully written. You did such a wonderful job of depicting neighborhoods and schools and homes, and I wanted to visit those places physically with you. I wanted to
go back. Yeah.
I wanted to go there and see where these places are. One of the amazing things you do with the book, I think, is reveal elements of New Orleans, places in New Orleans that the city hides not only from tourists, but also from itself. That these are places that the city, in some ways, doesn't want to acknowledge. This is one of the few books I've ever read on New Orleans that doesn't anchor itself in the French Quarter or the Garden District or even Uptown. It doesn't anchor itself in these romanticized geographies. This is one of the first books I've read that really sinks into New Orleans East. And even in New Orleans East, you situate neighborhoods there that preceded the attempt to make it quote unquote New Orleans East. You know, the sort of new suburb filled with big houses, a new development, a development that attracted a middle class, Your mother's house, the Yellow House, preceded that development project as well. So I'm going to come back to talk about New Orleans East, but I wanted to set that up first because I want those listening to understand that this is a different story of New Orleans, one that those of us who grew up there might know, many of us know, but that has not really been discussed before. And it's a story and a history of a neighborhood and of a family that I can also imagine many people would not think is worthy of a book. And I want to read a part from your book that talks about that in a way, and talks about how when we think of New Orleans East is not what most people think of, even if we're residents. And you had gone to college and you're home from college, your first summer back, and you wanted to take photos to take back to your college friends. And you say, you were working in the French Quarter, I think, in that summer. And you say about taking these photographs, I took no photos of New Orleans East, whose landscape, I told myself, was not what my friends had imagined they wanted to see when they asked to see New Orleans. Nothing in the landscape of New Orleans East signaled the New Orleans of most people's imaginations. No iconic street lamps, no street musicians playing in the flat industrial landscape, no streetcars running, no joggers. Walkers here did not stroll, they walked out of necessity. And then you say at the end of this description, I found the French Quarter beautiful in its performed liveliness, an escape from the East, and where I lived on the short end of Wilson. So again, this real division in the city between the place where most of us live, to be frank, as opposed to New Orleans, as opposed to the French Quarter and Uptown. And I'd love to hear you talk about then the process of deciding to write this book. It's a book, it's not about the New Orleans that most people are looking for when they hear New Orleans. Why did you think that you wanted to write this book, write about your family, write about New Orleans East?
Well, I'm still very interested in the ways in which we, not just as citizens and people, human beings belonging to cities and places, but we as Americans, the sort of narratives and stories we cling to about the places where we come from. I'm always intrigued and maybe love most the people I meet who say, oh, I'm from a small town in Iowa. You wouldn't know the name of it. I always say, tell me, say out loud the name of the place you're from, because this matters so much to me. And what I saw in this story was also inability, because in the section you just read, and it's terribly painful to hear your writing read. It's like, oh God, if only I could revise that. Yeah. But the thing that I think about instantly is the ways in which I myself had internalized these sort of feelings about New Orleans East. And I think my general sense growing up was so multi-layered. And that's why it felt to me that the narrative itself needed to be so, because not only was New Orleans East this actually really interesting historical place, I mean, it is part of American history for many reasons, but especially because of what was happening at NASA. But beyond that this place which had succumbed to so much name calling, that people were calling it, the edge of nowhere and the wilderness and the wild, and all of these ways in which it was sort of branded as a nothing place, right? Without meaning, made me feel a little bit irate, right? Which is the basis of all advocacy for yourself and for justice, because I was looking around at all of my family and all of the people I knew and loved and saying, we see each other, we matter to each other. So something is deeply wrong about this omission. And it only made me want to know why the omission, why has it sort of been written off, not talked about? Why isn't it part of the official narrative of the place? You know, and I think that that process of discovery was so meaningful to me. And frankly, I could only talk about 1/100th of the things I wanted to say about New Orleans East, and still tell this very complicated family story. But at base, I thought about the work and act of cartography and how to stand in that position, which is a tricky one, and reframe things a little bit.
So well said. It also makes me think of the ways, so within New Orleans, you're saying that New Orleans East was seen as the edge of nowhere. But I feel like in the nation, sometimes New Orleans itself is seen as this place that's not really connected. And as we deal with rising waters and what should be saved, how to save places, one of my fears is that the way that you describe New Orleans East will be the way that Lower Louisiana will be described, that New Orleans will be described.
As a kind of buffer zone, an environmental buffer zone, which I think in certain ways we can see that already developing in the story, in the media stories. And I think, you know, I'm still heartbroken by how quickly Lake Charles in particular just came in and out of people's consciousness, which I think only demonstrates the kind of speed at which things are flowing through the news cycle and how easy it is to forget. It's almost hard in these days to remember the people dying daily of COVID. And so that these areas, that the Gulf Coast writ large will become a kind of place that doesn't matter, that will just save us, right, from the terrors is I think real.
I think so. I definitely think so. Well, we're going to come back to New Orleans East if we have time, but you also mentioned that you could only address some of it because you were dealing with this big, mapping out this incredible family history as well. And people have called your book a memoir, but it's also very much a rich family history. You're the youngest of 12. Your oldest siblings are born in the 60s. You're born in around, well, later than that, 1979, I think. But you start your story with your grandmother and her siblings uptown, and then your mother's marriage and her very early marriage and widowhood, which is just amazing. And then her marriage to your father, Samuel. And then, so these stories of marriage and childbearing, of family secrets, of life and death are so complex. And you're the baby of the family, right?
Yes.
And so how did you get people to talk to you? And were there things, I mean, you can't tell me the things they wouldn't tell you, or they said, don't write about it. Well, how did you move through that process as a writer and as a researcher of talking to your family and getting these stories and these histories about them?
Well, I think, you know, my family, first of all, they're used to having a nosy little baby going around. And, you know, my mother says that I was the kid who never took a nap. I always, you know, the moment one half of an eye would close, I would hear a story getting told about something and suddenly come back alive and want to know. So I think it's just part of who I am. But it was actually really troublesome to begin to try to interview my family because, you know, now of course the book exists and it seems so coherent at times, right? You're just sort of telling this long running story. But when I started the reporting and research, there were maybe three family stories that were told, and they were these big, broad stories. And so my work was actually to drill down to kind of collect this granular detail. And, you know, you maybe have 100 hours of interviews. And maybe from that you collect 5 crucial detail, you know, but you have to listen to all 100 hours. So what I realized in the middle of it, because I knew that I wanted it to sort of include reporting, but I realized that it would be impossible for me to report on my family, that I needed to sort of be more in the position of an anthropologist in a way, a participant observer, that I needed to get in, I need to be inside of this unit, and sort of collect their oral histories essentially. And then also that was useful to me because then they could kind of come alive in the book. You could hear what they sound like, and that was really important to me. But I think it was never easy, and even now, even today, it's hard. It's a hard thing to have written because many of us are so trained to, you know, protect, and I did protect to some large degree, and I got people's permission for many, many things I wrote, but I wasn't interested in hagiography, and I thought that, you know, part of my sort of impetus for wanting to make this book was feeling like I had never seen a coming of age story of a Black girl growing up in New Orleans East, really, never. And so I needed to tell that story as honestly as possible. And all of my family who were part of that, right? I needed them to be real people on the page so that it didn't sort of veer into this myth, which was the very thing I was trying to break down. And I think to make the point about what happens when we helicopter up and think we know people, and the utter difference when you're inside of the life itself, you know, and I think just as a reporter and a journalist, it's something I care deeply about, even still.
It's a wonderful way to put it. And it makes me think of New Orleans again as a place with a lot of secrets. You know, people, you know, you probably have this experience too. Oh, you're from New Orleans. Yeah, I was on Bourbon Street. I was in the French Quarter. I was in Square. And there's a way that New Orleans keeps its secrets, its family secrets. The people who live there are actually very reserved. And so to break through that, and to tell an honest story about it, it's difficult. When you were so there are times in the book when it sounds like you have direct quotes, maybe from but are there other parts of the book that you would be in a conversation and then you'd rush home and sort of take notes and write it down? Or
well, I had a recorder that I took everywhere with me, and this recorder was wonderful, but also a pain, because at a certain point, I remember my brother Michael looking to me and saying, "So are we hanging out now, or is this like an interview thing?" Because, you know, it's sort of like people on a reality show. I realized that you could get so much more if you know, I would always have the recorder in some obvious place, but when people were relaxed and they didn't feel that you were in a formal interview, and I think it became very complicated, and even in the work of transcribing my siblings, it was really painful to do because I felt a closeness to them that wasn't actually happening in reality. You know, maybe I hadn't talked to them for weeks, but they were in my ear every day. And I got to know them in some way that I think now can feel very one-sided. You know, were they getting to know me equally? And so that's I think a question that I think about sometimes.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the house, the Yellow House. And for those who have or haven't read the book, your mother purchases this house when she's 18 with the insurance money from her first husband's death, and it's an investment. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about it as the center of your book is that, of course, owning a home is the American dream. And New Orleans is a place where historically Black people have owned property more so than in other
Yes.
all the way back to the 19th century. It's a good investment. It has provided stability for that community, for our community. Home ownership has been key to a lot of the amazing things about New Orleans and about the Black community there. But I wonder if by the time you're growing up in the 80s and 90s, if the meaning of home ownership changed in New Orleans, and what you would say happened with your mother about this excellent investment. What happened to make it problematic in a sense? It felt difficult. What do you think about her understanding the promise of home ownership and then the difficulties your mother had to?
Well, I think interestingly in the 80s and 90s, so everything, there are moments, of course, in everyone's life, I think, where everything starts to just clarify and you understand, oh, okay. So my mother tells this profound story of how on the day they moved in 1965, a few months before Betsy would come roaring through, that they had to build the ground back up, she told me. And she had been telling this story for many, many years, but then you come to realize, oh, okay, subsidence. And so this person, the house she was able to buy was on land that already was subsiding on the day she moved in, right? So this is where we start to think about all the systemic and structural things, right? And then beyond that, that houses, as I now know, are in a perpetual state of entropy. And there's always, always, always something to fix. And so it's the dream can't begin and end at you've acquired a house. The dream has to now be maintained. And the question of who can maintain the dream is not, for me, very dissimilar from who came back right away after the storm and the flooding. It's not indistinct actually from the question of who is still gone, who can't come back. And I think that in this way, this sort of moment for my mother of buying a house and all that it signified, we ultimately see quite clearly that this is in fact not a great investment on any level for her. That those of us who have actually bought places and have seen their value rise, right? That's not the case for many people of color, because first of all, we already started a deficit because the land isn't worth anything because it's already on sinking ground. In addition to that, we start to see how the neighborhoods changed. That has to do with zoning, that has to do with public policy and planning. All those sort of processes that are happening far away from the short end of Wilson Avenue where I lived, those processes were in fact affecting my life. And I found it as an adult looking back on it, kind of stunning how geography played such a kind of crucial role in this, that in fact, not only did we feel cut off from the rest of town because we couldn't find work, we had to take several buses. The act of this, I really have never seen people talk enough about the process of taking multiple buses away from your home just to make a living. That is laborious. It's a job, on top of a job. And I did it, went from my teenage years onward. And then you see that just the act of getting to school or to the grocery store was freighted for us because, we lived where you had to cross Chef Highway. So we're in danger. So this is actually more than a metaphor. This is literal. And I think the work of understanding this proximity or distance from, the work of understanding the actual profundity of what you see outside your window and what that does or does not say about the quality of your life. This is real. This is not a metaphor. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another way of answering your question, which is to say, we start to see how it stacks.
Absolutely. And I think, this plays into all the conversations we're having right now about the wealth gap with African Americans, mm-hmm. redlining,
Mm-hmm.
available and what's
Sure.
available. So, your mother's purchase of that house links back to the fact that for some time the lower Ninth Ward was the only place that African Americans could buy. So
Mm-hmm.
here, your mother's house is on the edge of what becomes, on the one hand, again, as I said before, New Orleans East, this new suburb filled with
Mm-hmm.
fancy new houses and
Mm-hmm.
a middle class, and this idea of suburbia.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, she's on the edge of that. And what's so interesting to me, you described that as that New Orleans East, that big fancy subdevelopment piece of New Orleans East is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Miller Park moves in across the street from you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not at all the vision of New Orleans East that I grew up with or that was discussed.
Right.
The suburban promise of New Orleans East is about middle class wealth and big yards and cars.
And I think that existed, and I think part of what is unavoidable in a book, as you know, is that, sometimes you don't have the 50 pages to break this all down. But, I tried to make it clear that for some people that was in fact happening.
Absolutely.
But I'm very interested in all of these short ends of long streets, these sort of cut, because I think by looking at those sort of pieces, we can actually start to make a greater calculation about the area at large. And my thing is, even for the people who weren't cut off, who had the nice sort of suburban house, if you still only have 2 grocery stores, what does any of it matter?
Right.
And so it's also about resources and access, right? That I think that is a kind of lesson about the place that you live that can form you and really shape your ideas about what it means to be you in the world.
I want to say too that your description, I mean, in some way, New Orleans East was considered a suburb. And we're living in a moment now when suburbs are changing similarly. People have not talked about enough. There are many now working class people, many more in immigrant communities. I lived in Atlanta for a long time and watched working class people move out to the suburbs and also have this bus trip that you're talking about, or very long commutes. I think that your book is prescient in a way of that experience for many more people that we're not quite aware of as a nation and need to become more aware of. So I really appreciate that.
And can I just say something about a special homesickness that I still have for New Orleans? I'm going to be there soon, so my homesickness is waning. But, I wanted to talk about, I think people, it has become a sort of thing that people talk about, that, oh, when I'm away, I need to go back and I miss it. But that's real. That's really real. And with all the mythology and all of its sort of capacity as a city to exceptionalize itself, there is something deeply nuanced and textural and specific about the city of New Orleans. And I wanted to also talk about that longing, that feeling you can have for wanting to go back. And for me, so much of that feeling came from the community I was living in and the land itself. And that feels so organic and Native American to me, right? That you would be pining over this ground. It's a spiritual thing. So I don't want to discount that, because for me, that's at the base of it all, which is that I think there is a way those of us who belong to New Orleans long for it, and find something special there. But I also don't think we need to exceptionalize it for that to be true.
I think that's such an important statement, because you're really threading, you don't want to be, as you said, it's not a hagiography. You're not creating something unreal. Your love for it is rooted in the lived experience of it, your reality of it. And we can love things, people, places deeply, even when they're imperfect, or even because they're imperfect.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. One of the things you said just now, which leads me into this question, is about what you could see outside your window and what was available to you, and the ways that you, maybe there were things that you couldn't see. And I really, one of the strong points in the book is that description of Chef Couture Highway, and how you had to cross it to get to school, to get, to the bus, to whatever, and how dangerous it was. But the other, and related to this, what struck me in the book is when you talked about going to college. You were 4.0 GPA, you were editor of the high school yearbook, and I'm reading this and thinking, wow, must have, gone to college. Your sister had gone to New York.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had this right. You say that no one really talked to you about going away to school or going to college, even in New Orleans. Like, they didn't say, hey, maybe you get a full scholarship to Tulane, or hey,
Yeah, no.
Could you talk to, okay, I will say that as a New Orleanian, it's not completely surprising to me, but yet it still is. What did, not from your school, talk to me about that. What do you think that's about? Because that is such a limitation of vision as well.
It's sort of astounding, actually. There can be no explanation for that except for the obvious one. It's funny because it makes me think about my missing teeth. And, people who know me are pretty disgusted with me talking about my teeth, but it's so important to talk about my teeth because, we went to the local dentist when I was growing up. And at the time I was really into Laffy Taffy candy, and so my teeth were just a total mess. So me and my sister went to the local, supposedly free, but in fact he wasn't free, dentist. And we had all these cavities, and there was a choice. We could either get our teeth filled, and we were quite young, or we could get them pulled. And I remember the dentist really advocating that we get these teeth pulled, because then we wouldn't have to worry about them. And so as a grown woman going to the dentist, to the actual dentist for the first time, I remember my dentist saying, oh my God, this guy who pulled your teeth, you never pull teeth. That's the last thing you ever do to teeth. And he said, wow, he really, really didn't think very much of your future, because he thought, I'll save her from this because she's not going to be a person who's going to care very much about these missing teeth. And of course, this has cost me so much money and time and pain not having these teeth. And my sister has the same missing teeth. So I think that's a way of answering your question, which is just a complete lack of vision. Just complete lack of vision, really.
And I want to really reinforce that this is not 1955. This is not.
Right, no. Right, this is the 90s.
This is the
80s and the 90s.
Decades after, supposedly, we fought for all these things. Decades into people saying, we fixed that. It's a colorblind society. And yet, it's stunning.
Mm-hmm.
Both the physicality of that story and this idea that you could be such a leader in your school and no one even forget, you don't have to leave New Orleans to get a good college education.
Or even Tulane or Xavier or Loyola or UNO or SUNO. Anywhere I would have gone. But I think it's useful now because there's so much I understand now in hindsight that I didn't understand then. And I think it goes back to why I also wanted in this story to talk about education, because I talk about the way in which my brothers were educated, not just me. And there are all different sorts of systems in our family. And, one of the things that, now there's the question of pro-charter, anti-charter. I mean, there are all of these questions, but at the end of the day, if we had good schools everywhere, right? That's really the goal and the drive. And I just remember feeling in the school system that I was just a nothing, you know? I mean, and I think that sort of feeling I had led me also not to be aggressive about where I might go to college. And so part of it, I think, was also that no one told me, but I also wasn't asking.
How could you know to ask or not to ask, though, if there's no, anyway, anyway, yeah. We have maybe 10 more minutes, and so I want to skip down and ask you a question. As you move through the book and through the house and your family's relationship to the house, and then the house is destroyed after Hurricane Katrina, in a similar pattern of, people thinking that it was meaningless and not taking care to find out who owns it and what the story is. And it's then that you realize all that it contained for you and all that it meant for you. And you said it contained all of my frustrations and many of my aspirations, the hopes that it would one day shine again, meaning the house would one day shine again. The house held my father inside of it. It bore his traces. And then suddenly he was gone because I had no home. And that home was where he had last been. When the house fell down, something in me opened up. I guess I wonder how the fall of that house, in a way, it opened you up. It also reconnected you in some deep way to your family. It feels like there's a kind of understanding, painful as it is, that also happens when the house goes away in that time.
That's an interesting question. I mean, in the book, I describe the large family like an amoeba, and that feels very real to me, that you're sort of all moving in various directions, but, sort of together. And in a way, I think a house, as far as it represents a kind of central point from which you've come, a origin story. If a house represents an origin story, then we also have that. And I think what becomes of us when we face loss or the disintegration of a central story in a family. And I think my family, we all were kind of reeling from our individual losses and from this also collective loss. And how we respond to loss is so vastly different from the stuff you say when you're looking at something and it's there in front of your face. And so I do think it made us, because we were all unmoored in these different ways, we started to sort of relate to each other differently, less with our kind of the veil that we were putting over everyone, or our sense of, okay, you're the baby, this is how you behave, and you're the oldest and you must behave like this, but that it sort of freed us in a way, in scary ways often. But that was useful for the book because I could try to think about why it would have that effect. And it brought me to this very deep understanding that I still believe that people inhabit space deeply, and that there are traces, right? Many of us know that for sure. And that we are people with traces. And I think that harkens to the way in which in our physiology, in our genetics, that I could be carrying something from a great grandmother who I never met, in my makeup, in my composition, in my continence, in the way I carry myself. And so I think it was just this moment, the loss of the house, that for all of me and my siblings, we had to just figure out what it meant for each of us, and maybe that's unending.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Um, so I won't go into all of this, but I'll just say that you have many travels, including a trip to Burundi after Katrina. You come back to New Orleans, and at some point I'm going to ask you about that trip to Burundi, but not tonight. But then you return to New Orleans after you go to Burundi. You work for Mayor Nagin for a while. And then the economic contradictions that are emerging in the city, become clear. The rising rents, we talked about a little bit the people who left and who haven't been able to come back. I think that's still something that we have underestimated in some kind of way, that even people, people who are unable to come back, repair their homes, reclaim their lives.
Sure.
You talk about your brother Michael, who was a chef at Giacomo's and who felt that he was not able to reclaim his place there. He had given a lot to that restaurant. So I guess I wonder what you're thinking about now. You come back to New Orleans a lot. What is this process that we're in? What are we still carrying from 2005 as a city, as communities, as families, as people? Just very, and this will be my last question, so we'll then ask, find out what questions our audience has. But I think that that's a really important part of your book as well. What do we continue to carry and try to repair, and what does it mean? So I guess I'm wondering where are you now in relationship to New Orleans and to your family, and where's your family in relationship to New Orleans?
Well, it's interesting. I think, I'm lucky because I have so many siblings. So I've seen every iteration. There are the people who have come back and still struggled. There are the people who, fled the water in 2005 and are now fleeing fire in Northern California where they escaped to. There are people, I think, who have come home and are happy. There are people who have come home and are miserable. And they're the people like my brother Carl who can't be out of, New Orleans for 3 seconds without, shriveling up and, not being able to function. So I think I've seen it all. And one of the things I think a lot about is community, and how fragmented that becomes when it becomes an economic game. And we see that a lot too in New York and in Harlem, which is a place I love because of the people who are Southern, who live here, and the sort of texture. It has that kind of textural quality in the same way New Orleans does. But the ritual of New Orleans, which is what I like most when I'm home, that is just counted on. We're just counted on to do certain things at a certain time. And that ritual, it literally becomes such a compass, I think, for the self. And I think the city hasn't changed in that particular way. And I don't know, I don't have any big answers about what to hold on to, but I think my job as a writer is to be looking at the underbellies of things, to be interrogating, to be going beyond what seems so obvious onto the other part of it, which is more scary for all of us. And I think that is the lesson we're in now, that we actually are seeing what happens when you don't examine anything, when everything is swept under the carpet, when nothing is dealt with, when we live and die by our mythologies. This point in the book where I talk about defining yourself, what it means to let a place stand in for you, to let it do all the speaking for you, to not claim something else as an identity. And I think we're seeing it just completely explode right now, because this idea that America is great is founded on what exactly?
And at what cost? Just to say
at
that.
what cost?
Yeah.
At what cost? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was such an honor. I love your work so much. So thank you.
I appreciate that. I love this book. It's beautiful. I love your thoughtfulness. This conversation was even more amazing than I imagined. So thank you.
Yeah.
So
Thank
I'm getting questions for us from on my phone. So I'm gonna go in and start them, and we'll see how far
Okay.
we can get. Oh, okay. So the first question, which is a question I have as well. Has your family read the book? What are their thoughts? And the person says that they loved your brothers and felt like they knew them after they
Oh, good. My family, you know, they're all over the map. I mean, my mom has a running joke that she has to be careful what she says around me now, which is fine. I tell her I'm never ever going to write another book about my family. She has nothing to worry about. But I think it's hard to be written about, and I feel vulnerable too. And you know, they're private people. They didn't ask, you know, to have me in their world, but I think that there's some part too where they understand that this is sort of great to have the stories collected here in this way. And I know that I have many nieces and nephews, and I think I feel proudest of that they're able to kind of open the book and actually just learn about their own family history, and that feels really like an empowering thing. And I really hope, you know, my dream is that there will be many, many other voices who, you know, do it 1,000 times better than I did. And this is just a very tip of the iceberg type book as far as I'm concerned.
And I agree with you, not just because I'm writing a book, but I think that there's so many stories in New Orleans, and as much as people think they know it, I think people really don't. And
Sure.
yeah. A question about your time in Burundi. How did it influence you and your heart-opening response to write the book? Did it help you open up in some way to write the book?
To write the Burundi?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Burundi was sort of great because but I believe this in general, that the farther you can get away from the spot you're writing about, the more it sort of reflects on where you've come from, the greater the distance. I really believe that. And I like to think of myself as a very global person. And so it was interesting to be in this Central East African country, which has such an intriguing history, which I can't get into now. And I was so obsessed with it that it was half of the book, the Burundi section, and my editor was like, no, this is a single chapter. But I was fascinated by Burundi because, first of all, it's so misunderstood, so unknown, but it's really this exceptional place. And the people are fantastic, and they're very interesting, but no one knows who they are. And they define themselves by being Rwanda's neighbor. You know, if you ask a Burundian, you know, where's Burundi? They say, oh, next to Rwanda. You know, and so I really related to that. It was also the moment in my world where I was completely unmoored, where I could sort of go to Burundi and I was without all of these sort of frames that I had given myself. I was without all my myths, and it really pushed me to certain realizations. So yeah, it was super interesting in that way.
Let's go through the questions again. How do you characterize New Orleans East today? Pre-Katrina is really built up with the plaza, Methodist Hospital, but post-Katrina it doesn't seem to have come back. And then this person says, I grew up in the section called the Goose in the 50s and 60s. My mother, like yours,
Oh yeah,
we were going into town. Do you see that area becoming more prosperous again, New Orleans East?
I hope so. There are some incredible people in New Orleans East, and they're starting new businesses. And some of my favorite humans, like the writer Maurice Ruffin, is a New Orleans Easterner. And I feel like any place, it is the product of its citizens, right? And individuals actually have enormous power to make change. So yeah, I'm always hopeful about that. And I'm always in the East. When I go home, if I want to see many of my brothers, I go to the East. So it's still my place very much.
Thank you. This is someone who was excited to hear you talking about Livingston and Abramson and talking about the fact that the public schools are charters. There's so many charters. Do you feel, what's it like for you when you're back home and noting how your neighborhood schools aren't the same in name or culture? Do you miss not having those schools to return to? Is that something that?
Do I miss going to a school called Jefferson Davis? No.
I hear you. Someone is asking what's next for you, but there are other questions about the book, but I'll come back to that.
Oh, what's next? Oh, yes, many things.
Yeah.
Come on.
Are any of those things?
No, I just want to make them.
And someone asked where you live now, and you live in Harlem now, basically. But
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
And then someone asked, is Michael still a chef?
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Can you tell us where he's cooking?
Well, it's interesting because he was working at Cape Paul's, and then Cape Paul's closed, quite recently. And so now he's doing his own thing, and I think he loves it. He's possibly somewhere in the city in a food truck. I mean, he's like doing his independent thing. So I'm super proud of him.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a comment I love so much about this book. And I want to say I'm seeing the chat pop up and people are like, I love this book, I love this book. So there's a lot of love for this book.
Yeah.
This virtual room we're in.
There's someone named Lena who tells me that it seems she really knew my family, and also she's fact checking me, which is great. Lena, I just want to say I'm going to change the name of that. Thank you for letting me know I got that church name wrong.
Great. I'm very happy I read it, and I was absolutely thrilled to see Dominica listed as somewhere you wrote part of the book in. You were in Dominica when you were doing some writing. My question is, in retrospect, is there anything you would have liked to include in this book that wasn't, or things you discussed that you would have removed?
Yeah, so much. I mean, there was so much editing and removing, and I think there could be 10 more books for just from things I removed. But I think I feel that the discussion I'm able to have in this book about the East feels very peripheral to me, and that's because I think it needed to work narratively, and I was trying to tell many stories. So there are ways in which I wish I could have spent more time just in talking about the East, But I think the high notes came through, but yeah.
And I think, you said before, it has this really rich history with NASA and the Pfizer and all this stuff that really is, we don't think about very much. Again, when we think about New Orleans. So another question, we have to scroll up. Oh, as a New Orleanian who has traveled and is back now, this person is a New Orleanian who has traveled and is back now. I'm feeling called away from the city again to raise my family somewhere else. Can you share what helped you make the choice to leave the city? It's a hard city to leave, as you've mentioned. So why did you decide not to live in New Orleans?
That's interesting. New Orleans, but I think this could just be that I'm ruined a little bit by New York City. I think when I'm home, I very quickly realize how small it is again. And I'm just like, okay, I know everyone and everyone somehow knows me. And I think I've always wanted to live in a big city, and I'm very used to it now. I really like it. And in Harlem, too many people know you too. But it's possible to go in areas where you can completely become anonymous. So I like having both of those things. I still think that, you know, New Orleans is a really hard place, frankly, to make a living. And I know that particularly because it actually is playing out in the lives of not just my brothers and sisters, but even cousins. And there's serious ageism. There are people who are excellent at what they do who can't find work. And I don't think that that's a myth, you know, that's real. And so I think it's just super hard sometimes to imagine living there full time, but I'm there a lot. So it feels like the best of both worlds, you know.
So someone is asking, if you were to buy a house in New Orleans now, where would you buy? Where would you go?
There are many neighborhoods. I love so many neighborhoods in New Orleans. I can't say just one, but
that's fair.
Yeah.
Who are some of your literary inspirations?
Mm-hmm. So many. Natasha Trethewey, who I'm thinking about a lot these days, the poet June Jordan, and Jamaica Kincaid, and of course Toni Morrison, and there's so many, Gail Jones, John Edgar Wideman. Yeah, they change, you know, I have my sort of biblical text, and then I keep adding people who I'm reading along the way. There's this writer, Deisha Philgraw, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies.
Oh, I don't know.
So she's like my newest love. And then I'm rereading Randall Keenan because he died recently, and remembering how much I love him. So, yeah.
When you were writing the book, what were you reading? Were you reading fiction or nonfiction or?
A huge collection of things, because I was reading a lot about architecture and about cities. I was reading a ton of Jane Jacobs. I was reading about homesickness in all its forms. I was reading, but a ton of architecture books, a ton of New Orleans books. I was reading almost every book that's ever been written about New Orleans, just to see what people were talking about. Yeah, and fiction, tons of fiction. I was reading this writer, Nicole Krauss, who wrote a book called Great House. And I was reading Jamaica Kincaid's autobiography of my mother, for how it was talking about loss. You know, so, and then a lot of the people who became epigraphs in the book, you know, the philosopher Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Space, and just thinking a lot about geography and maps and things like that.
This is kind of related to that question and a previous question. Is there more New Orleans East writing than to come? And I could ask that of you. You have all this stuff that didn't make the book, but are there other people you know who are writing? And when you were doing the reading, did you find people writing about New Orleans East at all?
I don't know that every person I met who was from the East, I was like, write your story, right? I don't even care what your story is, just write it. But I wish I knew more about people, you know, who are writing from New Orleans and New Orleans East in particular. I should learn that. I want to go find out. I'm going to do I really want to do some public library events once we're all back in our new world that we're going to be living in. It would be great to do some events in the East and really kind of be there a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah, and also maybe just talking to young people too. Might have ideas, but not quite sure how to make it into a book.
Sure. And someone's asking, is that a pencil sharpener on my wall? Yes.
Yes.
Here's my pencil. So I actually use it.
Wow, that's impressive. This is someone who, I work in Algiers, and like New Orleans East, Algiers is often left out of the New Orleans narrative. You mentioned making sure both New Orleans East and Algiers made it into the mayor's speeches. And for those who haven't read the book, when Sarah comes back, she's working as a speechwriter for the mayor. And so you were trying to make sure that New Orleans East and Algiers made it in. How does your view of the East and New Orleans shape how you think about cities and their forgotten suburbs overall? Do you think about this question? Is it similar in other cities that you've lived in or experienced?
Yeah, I think it helps me think of every place where I've ever been or where I ever lived. One of the things I like to do when I'm traveling is go, I like to go to the places nobody tells you to go to, or the forgotten places. And those people are generally the more interesting people to talk with. And they normally can tell you the entire problem with the place pretty quickly. I did this when I was in various parts of Spain, and I did this when I was even in Morocco for a time. And it's, I think, my journalistic instinct, but it always makes sense. And I like to look also at the public institutions to see how they're doing. And I think there's so much also about architecture, which can communicate so much about the status of places, right? So yes, this has, I think, framed my entire way of being in the world.
That's so interesting. I have a question that asks, have you done events with U.S. immigrant communities? As an immigrant to this country, I found the book super resonant about loss and nostalgia for my own tiny elsewhere places.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I suspect that missing New Orleans is different in its own way, especially because of the flood.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had conversations with immigrant groups?
No, but I love that. I really wrote this book for people who really have a strong sense of connection to place, and who see in place, and even in a temporary place, something to hold on to, something with meaning. And so I would like to talk more to immigrant communities. And those are the people, those are my audience. Those are the people who I wrote the book for. So it actually is so moving to me to hear this person say that. And I just want to thank them for reading, and just know that it means the world to me.
Thank you. Someone says, forgive me if you mentioned this already, but how was your view of the mayor after Katrina? Do you still talk with him ever?
No.
We'll leave that.
Another one-word answer. I don't talk with him. And yeah, I think I've said everything I wanted to say about him in the book.
In the book, yes. I think that might be it for our questions.
Wow.
Yeah, this has been wonderful. Thank you someone in the questions also said this too, and I want to channel them, but thank you for your generosity, both in writing the book and then in what you shared tonight. It was really wonderful to be so open, and that is really
Thank you so much. This was really great. I always love doing things for New Orleans and for Louisiana. So this is special to me. Thank you.
And I want to say to all the people who came tonight, and as people were coming in, they were talking with each other and saying, I've read the book, I haven't, and it had that feel, even though we're not physically in the same place. I felt that energy, that New Orleans.
That's so great. Thank you. Thank you everyone for reading this book. It means so much. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure if Sarah's going to come back on.
Yes, I just want to pop back on to say thank you so much to Leslie and to Sarah. And I see some people who turned on their video to applaud. It has been such a treat to hear from you both, to hear your perspective on the city and on your family and on this moment. And also such a treat to hear and read comments in the chat. We've gotten some really beautiful comments from people about your own experiences with the city and moving away from the city. I know there were a couple comments about hearing and about the recording, and I promise that we will send it out to everyone who registered in the next few days. So if you missed part of the program this evening, you'll have a chance to rewatch it. And I hope that we are able to gather in person sometime in the not too distant future for more programs. Can't wait to hear more from both of you on the work that you have created and are continuing to create. So thank you for your expertise, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. We hope to see you again soon.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.